Some gifts are not meant to be opened. Some secrets are not meant to be kept. And some truths, once buried, refuse to stay silent, clawing their way back to the surface with a quiet, relentless force that reshapes history itself. December 1873. The air hung heavy and damp over the Mississippi River Delta, a shroud of mist clinging to the ancient cypress trees and winding bayous. In the wealthy plantation districts, where the scars of war were still fresh, but the illusion of grandeur persisted, a transaction took place. It was a transaction whispered about in hushed tones, a dark echo of a past that many claimed was dead, yet still clung to the land like Spanish moss. Two girls, twins barely 14 years old, their names and histories meticulously erased, were purchased at a private auction. They were not destined for labor in the fields, nor for domestic service in the grand house. No, their fate was far more sinister, wrapped in red velvet and presented as Christmas morning gifts for the Baron's two dissolute sons. What happened next was not a tale of supernatural intervention, nor a grand rebellion. It was a story woven from quiet observation, desperate courage, and an almost unbelievable act of defiance. What these two girls did in the spring of 1874 would not only unravel three families, but it would also expose a conspiracy of silence so deeply entrenched that it had become the very bedrock of the community. It would force an entire county to burn its records, relocate its courthouse, and collectively pretend a whole winter never happened. The Baron who bought them was never seen again. His legacy dissolving into rumor and speculation. His sons were found, yes, but what had been done to them, not physically, but to their very essence, was something no one could explain, something that defied the crude justice of the era. And the twins, they vanished, not into thin air, but into a network so vast, so meticulously hidden that even today, historians refuse to discuss it on record, fearing the implications of its true reach. Before we delve deeper into the chilling account of the Baron and the twin girls who irrevocably altered the course of St. Helena Parish, I urge you to consider the weight of forgotten histories. If you are drawn to the darkest corners of American history, the stories they deliberately omit from textbooks, the events they desperately tried to erase, then I ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell and tell me in the comments below what state are you listening from. Because this story, though rooted in the Louisiana Delta, touches more places, more lives than you might ever imagine. Now let us journey back to a time when the law was a malleable suggestion. When power was measured not just in acres of land but in the lives that toiled upon it. And when two children, innocent and unknowing, were gift-wrapped like dolls, destined for a fate that would either break them or forge them into something unbreakable. The parish of St. Helena, Louisiana, in the winter of 1873 was a place suspended in a perpetual twilight, caught precariously between the brutal realities of a war recently concluded and the uncertain dawn of a new grudgingly accepted freedom. 8 years had passed since the cannons fell silent, since the Emancipation Proclamation had theoretically shattered the chains of bondage. Yet reconstruction rather than healing had only deepened the festering wounds of the South, twisting old injustices into new insidious forms. The grand plantations, monuments to a bygone era of cotton kings and human cattle, still stood, their white columns, often chipped and peeling, gleamed defiantly in the weak winter sun, casting long skeletal shadows across fields that stretched to the horizon. But the labor that sustained them had changed, at least on paper. The fields were now worked by men and women who were legally free, yes, but practically enslaved by a system of debt and fear. Sharecropping had replaced the auction block, but the chains were simply made of invisible contracts, exorbitant interest rates, and the constant threat of eviction rather than cold, hard iron. The illusion of freedom was a cruel mirage shimmering just out of reach. Greensburg, the parish seat, was a small, dusty town, its population barely 800 souls. Yet it was the nerve center of St. Helena. It housed the courthouse, a squat brick building with a perpetually leaking roof, the land office, where every deed and mortgage was meticulously recorded, and the only bank for 30 miles. Its vault, a silent testament to the wealth concentrated in a few powerful hands. Greensburg was a town built on paper, on records, deeds, contracts, mortgages, titles, and the occasional bill of sale for livestock or equipment. Everything was written down. Everything was filed. And in 1873, those records were more valuable than gold. For they determined who owned what, and more critically who owned whom, even if the language had shifted from slave to debtor or tenant. The power of the written word, even when twisted, was absolute. At the very apex of this fragile, simmering world, sat a man, the locals, with a mixture of deference and disdain, simply called the Baron. His real name was Lucien Deo, though no one dared utter it in his presence without the honorific. He was not nobility by blood, not by any European standard, but he carried himself with an air of inherited superiority, as if the very land bowed to his will, tall with a shock of silver hair that seemed to catch the light even in dim rooms, and a voice like distant thunder rumbling across the delta. Deo was a force of nature. He owned 4,000 acres of prime delta land, rich and fertile, and controlled the labor of over 200 people. Technically, they were sharecroppers. Technically, they were free. But Deo held their debts, their contracts, their very livelihoods, and the futures of their children in a thick leather-bound ledger he kept locked in his study. A ledger more powerful than any law. His word was law, his ledger, scripture. He had 2 sons, heirs to his name and his dominion, but not to his cunning or his formidable will. The elder Henri was 22, a man already hollowed out by idleness and an inherited cruelty. He possessed his father's imposing height, but none of his calculated presence. Henri spent his days riding the property line on a magnificent black stallion, a rifle slung across his back, enforcing boundaries no one dared cross. He had cultivated a reputation for meanness, a chilling, quiet malevolence that didn't need to raise its voice to instill terror. Workers who displeased him found their rations mysteriously cut. Their cabins searched without warning, their children suddenly reassigned to the farthest, most backbreaking fields. His cruelty was a slow, methodical burn, designed to break spirits rather than bodies. The younger son, Julien, was 19, and if possible, even worse, where Henri was cold and calculating, Julien was volatile, a live wire of unpredictable rage and self-indulgence. He drank too much cheap whiskey, gambled away sums his father quietly covered, and took far too much pleasure in watching things break, be it a glass, a spirit, or a bone. He had been expelled from 2 different schools in New Orleans, returning home each time with mounting debts his father grudgingly paid, and a temper his father, for reasons no one understood, quietly ignored. Julien collected things. An array of gleaming guns, wickedly sharp knives, and exotic birds he kept in ornate cages until neglected and starved. They died. He was perpetually bored, and boredom in a young man with unchecked power and a cruel streak was a truly dangerous thing. A spark waiting for kindling. Lucien Deo loved his sons not for who they were but for what they represented, the continuation of his name, the perpetuation of his empire. He loved them as a king loves his heirs, as extensions of his own power. And in December of 1873, as the festive season approached, he decided to give them a gift that would bind them to him forever. A gift that would teach them the ultimate brutal lesson of power. That some people are not people at all, but things, and things, no matter their form, can be owned, controlled, and disposed of at will. The Devo estate, known simply as the Baron's Place by the locals, sat at the end of a long, winding oak-lined drive that seemed to stretch on forever, an auroral tunnel leading to a forgotten past. The house itself was a sprawling 3-story monument to a world that despite all evidence, Lucien refused to believe no longer existed. White-painted brick, its facade imposing and austere, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to stare out blankly, and wide verandas that wrapped around the entire structure, offering shade in summer and a chilling exposure in winter. Inside the rooms were vast and cavernous, filled with heavy dark furniture shipped from France, portraits of ancestors who were not truly ancestors, but rather carefully selected figures from European nobility, and a silence so profound, so thick it felt like a held breath, waiting for something to shatter it. In the quarters behind the main house, a community of 200 souls lived in cabins that had not seen repairs since before the war. These were not the picturesque whitewashed cottages of romanticized memory, but rough honeyed shacks, their roofs patched with tin, their walls chinked with mud, their floors bare earth. They worked the fields from the first blush of dawn until the last sliver of light faded from the sky. Their bodies aching, their spirits weary. At night they gathered in low voices, sharing what little they had. Meager portions of food, whispered stories of resilience, and urgent warnings passed from one generation to the next. They knew the Devo family. They knew the casual cruelty of Henri, the explosive temper of Julien, and they knew what happened to those who displeased them. In December of 1873, a new kind of unease settled over the quarters, a premonition that something was coming. Because the Baron had been making trips. 3 times in November, Lucien Deer had taken the steamboat down river to New Orleans, staying 2 or 3 days each time. He told no one where he went or what he did, his movements shrouded in his usual impenetrable secrecy. But when he returned, he carried himself differently, not with weariness, but with a subtle shift in his bearing, like a man who had made a momentous decision, and was deeply pleased with its implications. His sons noticed, exchanging uneasy glances, the workers noticed their eyes tracking his movements with a silent collective apprehension. And in a place like St. Helena Parish, where every gesture, every nuance, every secret trip held profound meaning, that kind of secrecy meant something ominous was brewing. On December 18, 1873, Lucien Deer made his final decisive trip to New Orleans. He returned on December 23, 2 days before Christmas, the air thick with anticipation and a biting chill. And he was not alone. The steamboat Crescent Belle, a paddle-wheeler whose ornate filigree belied its cargo of human and material goods, docked at the Greensburg landing just after sunset on December 23. The air was cold and damp, the kind of pervasive chill that seeped into one's bones and settled there, refusing to be dislodged. A thin ghostly mist rose from the dark swirling waters of the river, curling around the moss-covered pilings, and drifting like a phantom across the rough honeyed wooden planks of the dock. The few men unloading cargo, their breath pluming in the frigid air, worked with a frantic efficiency, eager to finish their arduous tasks and retreat to the meager warmth of their homes and hearths. Lucien Devo descended the gangplank alone, a solitary imposing figure. He carried a worn leather satchel clutched in one hand, and his long black wool coat, tailored to perfection, seemed to absorb the fading light, making him appear less a man and more a moving shadow against the twilight. He offered a curtain nod to the dock workers, his gaze sweeping over them with an almost imperceptible disdain, but he did not speak. His silence was a command, a barrier. Behind him, emerging from the dimly lit passenger cabin, 2 figures materialized, hesitant and small, against the vastness of the river and the encroaching night. They were girls, twins, identical in every discernible way, their features mirroring each other with an unsettling precision. They wore plain grey dresses, thin and threadbare, utterly inadequate for the biting cold that permeated the air. Their heads were covered with dark coarse shawls pulled low and tight, effectively obscuring their faces, rendering them anonymous. They carried nothing, no bags, no bundles, no small cherished belongings. Nothing to suggest they had come from anywhere specific or were destined for any particular place. They moved in perfect, almost synchronized unison, stepping off the boat together, stopping together, waiting together like 2 halves of a single silent entity. One of the dock workers, a man named Tobias Hall, a grizzled veteran of the riverfront, later recounted to his wife Martha that the girls never once looked up. Their eyes remained fixed on the ground, their gazes averted, as if the very act of looking might invite further misfortune. And when the Baron, with a dismissive flick of his wrist, gestured for them to follow, they did so without a moment's hesitation, without a single question, like shadows obediently trailing a body. Tobias, a man who had witnessed countless arrivals and departures, felt a prickle of unease. There was something profoundly unsettling about their absolute stillness, their utter lack of protest. Devo led them to a covered wagon, its canvas top stained and weathered, which stood waiting at the end of the dock. The driver, a man named Cato, a stoic and taciturn individual who had worked the Devo stables for decades, climbed down from the driver's seat, his face etched with years of sun and toil, betrayed no emotion as he opened the back flap of the wagon. The Baron gestured again, a silent command, and the twins, without a word, climbed inside, disappearing into the dark interior. Cato, his movements practiced and efficient, closed the canvas flap, securing it tightly. With a creak of wheels and a soft thud of hooves on the muddy road, the wagon rolled away, swallowed by the gathering darkness and the swirling river mist. No one asked questions. No one ever did. Not when it concerned the Baron. To question was to invite trouble, and trouble in St. Helena Parish often arrived with a swift, brutal finality. But Tobias Holt, who had seen many things in his 43 years, the rise and fall of river fortunes, the quiet desperation of the newly free, the casual cruelty of the powerful, said later that he felt something profound that night, a coldness that had nothing to do with the biting weather, a sense that something profoundly wrong, something deeply unnatural, had just arrived in St. Helena Parish, and that it would not leave quietly. Lie. It was a premonition. A shiver down his spine that lingered long after the wagon's rumbling faded into the night. The wagon took the river road, a narrow, winding track that followed the serpentine course of the Mississippi, back to the Dew estate. The journey, nearly an hour long, was arduous. The road was deeply rutted and uneven, a testament to years of neglect and heavy rains, and the wagon's wheels groaned and creaked with every jolt and turn, a mournful lament against the silence of the night. Inside the wagon, shrouded in darkness, the twins sat in perfect silence. Cato, who drove with his back to them, his senses attuned to the road and the horses, later swore that he never heard them speak. Not once, not a whisper, not a sigh, not even the subtle shift of breathing. It was as if they had ceased to exist, becoming mere cargo, silent and inert. When the wagon finally rolled through the imposing wrought iron gates of the Dew estate, it was nearly 8 o'clock. The house, a beacon of light in the surrounding darkness, was illuminated from within. Every window glowing with the warm, inviting lamplight that belied the coldness within its walls. Henry and Julien, their figures silhouetted against the bright interior, were waiting on the front ver, smoking cigars, their faces illuminated by the flickering embers, their eyes fixed on the long dark drive. When they saw the wagon emerge from the gloom, they straightened, flicked their cigars into the damp dirt, and descended the wide stone steps, their footsteps echoing faintly. Lucy and Devo climbed down from the wagon, a triumphant smile playing on his lips, a rare display of genuine satisfaction. He looked at his sons, his gaze sweeping over them with proprietary pride. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice warm and resonant, filled with a chilling pleasure. "Your Christmas gifts have arrived." Henry's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something akin to unease crossing his usually impassive face. Julien, however, grinned, a wide, predatory smile that revealed too much. Cato, ever efficient, opened the back of the wagon, and the twins, moving with their characteristic, unsettling synchronicity, climbed out. For the first time, bathed in the bright, unforgiving light spilling from the house, the Dew's sons could see them clearly. They were undeniably young, 14, perhaps 15 years old. Their bodies still slender, not yet fully formed. Their skin was a warm, light brown. Their hair dark and braided tightly against their scalps, meticulously neat. Their faces, now fully visible, were indeed identical. High, delicate cheekbones, full, unsmiling lips, and dark, fathomless eyes that reflected the lamplight like polished obsidian, revealing nothing of the thoughts or emotions that lay beneath. They possessed a striking, almost ethereal beauty, the kind that made men uncomfortable, precisely because they were still children, and beauty in children, especially those in such a vulnerable state, was a dangerous, often tragic thing. Julien, ever the more impulsive and overtly cruel, stepped forward, circling them slowly, his gaze lingering, inspecting them with the detached scrutiny one might apply to a prize horse or a newly acquired hunting dog. Henry remained where he was, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. "Where did you find them, father?" Julien asked, his voice laced with a possessive curiosity. "New Orleans," Lucien replied, his tone smug. "A private sale, very private. They have no papers, no family, no history. As far as the world is concerned, they do not exist. They are ghosts waiting to be given form by our will." Henry's frown deepened, a subtle crease between his brows. "Father, the law," he began, a hint of caution in his voice. Even angry, with all his cruelty, understood the shifting sands of the post-war legal landscape. "The law," Lucien interrupted, his voice cutting, dismissive. "I say it is, Henry, and I say these girls are property. My property and now by extension yours, a gift, a lesson, a tool." He gestured to the twins, a sweeping proprietary motion. "They will serve you. They will obey you. They will do whatever you ask without question, without complaint. Consider them an education in power, gentlemen." Because power is not merely what you inherit. It is what you take. It is what you assert. It is what you command. Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that grated on the ears, devoid of genuine mirth. Henri, as was his custom, said nothing, his silence more chilling than his brother's laughter. The twins stood perfectly still, their eyes still fixed on the ground, their hands folded neatly in front of them, a picture of passive obedience. They did not react to Lucian's words, did not flinch, did not even seem to breathe. They simply waited, two silent statues in the harsh lamplight. Lucian Devo clapped his hands once, a sharp, decisive crack that echoed in the cold night air. "Take them inside," he commanded Cato, his voice now brisk and businesslike. "Put them in the east wing, the small room at the end of the hall. Lock the door and ensure they are fed sparingly." Cato nodded, his face still impassive, and gestured for the twins to follow. They did, moving with that same eerie unison, their footsteps silent on the wooden steps of the veranda, then fading into the echoing silence of the house. As they disappeared into the cavernous interior, Lucian turned back to his sons, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "Merry Christmas, gentlemen," he said, his voice a low purr of satisfaction. "Use them wisely and remember they are a testament to our enduring will." And then he went inside, leaving Henri and Julian standing in the biting cold, staring at the door through which the twins had vanished, the implications of their father's gift slowly settling upon them. That night, no one in the quarters slept well. The workers, huddled in their unheated cabins, whispered to each other in the dark, passing along what little they knew, what little they had observed, that the Baron had brought something back from New Orleans, something locked away in the East Wing, something that was a gift for his sons. The air was thick with unspoken fears, with the chilling understanding that the old ways, though legally abolished, were far from dead. And in the main house, in the small cold room at the very end of the East Wing, the twins sat on the bare floor in the impenetrable darkness, holding each other's hands, their bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort, and waited for Christmas morning, for whatever new horror it might bring. Their silence was not submission, but a deep, watchful stillness, a quiet assessment of their new prison. Christmas Day 1873 dawned not with the festive cheer of carols and bright lights, but with a cold, oppressive grayness. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy and unyielding, pressing down on the delta. A light, persistent rain began to fall just after sunrise. A soft rhythmic tapping against the tall narrow windows of the Deo house like the insistent drumming of fingernails on glass. A mournful accompaniment to the day. Inside, the Devo family gathered in the main parlor, a vast, dimly lit room dominated by a massive fireplace that offered little warmth. Lucian Devo sat at the head of the long polished mahogany table, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair combed back with meticulous precision, his expression serene, almost beatific, as if he had just performed a great act of benevolence. Cry and Julian sat on either side of him, both unusually quiet, their usual boisterousness subdued by their father's imposing presence, and the unspoken weight of the previous night's arrival. The table was set with the finest imported china, delicate porcelain adorned with intricate patterns and gleaming crystal goblets that caught the meager light. The breakfast, a lavish spread of smoked ham, fluffy biscuits, homemade preserves, and steaming coffee, was served by two women from the quarters, their faces impassive, their movements swift and practiced, their eyes meticulously kept downcast, avoiding any direct contact. No one mentioned the twins. Their presence, though palpable, was a silent, uncomfortable truth. An elephant in the opulent room. After breakfast, Lucian rose from the table, a subtle gesture of his hand commanding his sons to follow. They walked through the cavernous house in silence, their footsteps echoing on the polished wood floors, the sound amplified in the stillness, until they reached the East Wing, a less frequently used section of the house, colder and more sparsely furnished. Lucian produced a small ornate key from his waistcoat pocket, its brass gleaming dully, and with a soft click, unlocked the heavy wooden door at the very end of the hall. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, and sparsely furnished. A narrow, uncomfortable L-looking bed with a thin mattress, a single, rickety wooden chair, and a was-hand with a chipped porcelain basin. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of dust and confinement. The twins were sitting on the bare floor where they had been left the night before. Their bodies pressed together, still holding hands, still utterly silent. They looked up when the door opened, their dark eyes meeting Lucien's gaze for a fleeting moment, but their expressions did not change, remaining as unreadable as polished stone. Lucien stepped aside, a theatrical flourish, and gestured for his sons to enter the small, cramped space. "They are yours now," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion as if discussing a new piece of farm equipment. "Do with them as you please. They are yours to command." And then he left, closing the door behind him with a soft, definitive thud, leaving his sons alone with their gifts. What transpired in that small, cold room over the next 3 months is not entirely known, not in its full, brutal detail. The twins, Cora and Clarara, never spoke of it in later years. Their silence a testament to the unspeakable. And the Deo's sons, Hree and Julia, never offered any explanation, their memories conveniently selective. But there are fragments, whispers, pieces of testimony gathered later from the workers in the quarters, individuals who saw things, heard things, noticed things in the periphery of their own arduous lives. These fragments pieced together paint a chilling implicit picture. A woman named Deline, who worked in the main house as a cook, her hands perpetually stained with flour and grease, said that the twins were brought down to the kitchen every morning for a single meager meal. A crust of stale bread, a cup of water, sometimes if they were lucky, a piece of bruised fruit. They ate quickly, their movements precise and economical in silence, their eyes never meeting hers. As soon as they finished, they were taken back upstairs, their presence a fleeting, unsettling shadow. Deline swore they never looked at anyone, never asked for anything, never made a sound. Their silence was absolute unnerving. A man named Ezra, who tended the stables, his hands gnarled from years of handling horses and heavy equipment, said that he saw Julian Deere leading the twins out to the old carriage house one afternoon in late January. The air was crisp, the ground still hard with frost. He remembered Julian's laughter, a harsh, discordant sound that carried on the wind, and the twins' utter lack of response. Ezra said he heard sounds coming from the carriage house, sharp splintering sounds like wood breaking or something being struck. But he did not investigate. No one investigated. To investigate was to invite the Baron's wrath. And that was a price no one was willing to pay. He simply turned his back, pretending not to hear, not to see. A young girl named Bess, barely 12 years old, who worked in the laundry, her small hands perpetually chapped from lye soap and cold water, said that she saw the twins once through a window. It was a rare moment of stillness in her day. She said they were standing in their small room facing each other, their hands clasped together and their lips were moving, a silent rhythmic motion. She said it looked like they were praying, a desperate, unheard supplication, but she could not discern the words. Their faces, even from a distance, seemed etched with an ancient sorrow. And a man named Samuel, who drove the Deru carriage, a sturdy, reliable man who had served the family for decades, said that in early March he was ordered to take Henri and the twins into Greensburg. The spring air was beginning to soften, carrying the scent of damp earth and budding magnolia. He remembered Hungry sitting in the carriage with them, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead, while the twins sat perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes downcast as if carved from wood. Samuel said that when they reached the town, Henri took them into the courthouse, the very same courthouse where land deeds and contracts were filed, where the fate of so many was decided on paper, and they were inside for nearly an hour. When they emerged, Henri was smiling, a thin, satisfied curl of his lips, and the twins, as always, were not. Their faces remained blank, unreadable. Samuel, a man of quiet observation, said he asked Henri what they had done in the courthouse. A rare moment of curiosity overcoming his usual discretion. Henri, with a dismissive wave of his hand, told him to mind his own business, his tone sharp and warning. But Samuel noticed something. When the twins climbed back into the carriage, one of them, he could not tell which, for their resemblance was uncanny, was holding a piece of paper. It was folded small, tucked discreetly into the sleeve of her plain grey dress, almost invisible, but he saw it. Just for a fleeting moment, a flash of white against the drab fabric. He never saw it again. The paper, like so many other things in their lives, vanished into the shadows. By mid-March, the workers in the quarters were whispering about the twins. Not because of what they had seen, for they had seen little, but because of what they had not seen. The twins had been at the Diru estate for 3 long silent months. And in all that time, no one had heard them speak, not a single word. Not a cry of pain, not a sigh of despair, not even the softest sound of human utterance. Their silence was a profound, unsettling mystery. Some said they were mute, born without the gift of speech. Some said they were broken, their spirits crushed beyond repair. Some, the more superstitious among them, whispered that they were something else entirely, something unnatural, something touched by the spirits of the bayou. And then on the night of March 19, 1874, as the first fireflies began to dance in the humid air, everything changed. The long silent vigil was about to break. The twins, Cora and Clara, had not been idle in their confinement. Their silence was not a sign of submission, but a shield, a carefully constructed facade behind which their minds, sharp and resilient, worked with a quiet, desperate intensity. Their mother, back in Virginia before the fire, had been a seamstress, but she had also possessed a fierce love for learning. She had taught her daughters to read and write, skills considered dangerous for their station, but skills that would ultimately become their salvation. She had taught them to decipher the intricate loops and flourishes of the written word to unlock the secrets held within pages. In the deer house, a place where books were more often decorative than read, they had found a hidden treasure. In the dusty forgotten corners of the East Wing, in a small unused library that smelled of mildew and neglect, they discovered old books, volumes of lore, forgotten histories, even a few tattered novels. No one thought to lock them away, for who among the help would dare touch such things? And who among the dear family would even notice? Late at night, long after the house had fallen silent, after the last lamp had been extinguished, Cora and Clara would slip from their room. They moved like ghosts, their bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. By the faint, flickering light of a stolen candle stub, or sometimes by the pale glow of the moon filtering through a grimy window, they would read. They devoured the words, absorbing them, understanding them. They learned about the law, about contracts, about property and ownership, and most crucially about the chaotic, often contradictory legal landscape of Reconstruction. They learned that even in a system designed to oppress, there were loopholes, cracks in the facade if one knew where to look. They learned about the courthouse in Greensburg, about the ledgers, the filings, the official stamps that transformed mere words into undeniable truth. They understood that paper properly executed held a power even greater than the baron's wealth or his son's cruelty. When Henri had taken them into town in early March, ostensibly to file the document that officially registered them as property of the Dew family. A grotesque illegal act, yet one that went unchallenged in St. Helena Parish in 1874. Cora had seized her opportunity. While Henri, distracted and arrogant, spoke with the clerk, Cora, with a preternatural calm, had slipped away. She had found the records room, a dusty, dimly lit chamber filled with towering shelves of ledgers. Her eyes, trained by countless hours of secret reading, quickly located the specific ledger where the document was to be filed, and with a heart pounding like a trapped bird. She had stolen a blank page, a pristine sheet of official paper, its edges crisp, its surface waiting for words. It was that page, folded small and tucked into the sleeve of her dress, a tiny, fragile seed of hope that the twins now carried. It was their weapon, their shield, their only chance. They had endured the past 3 months not out of submission, but out of a desperate, calculated patience, waiting for the precise moment to strike. Their silence was not brokenness, but a profound, terrifying strength. March 19, 1874 was a Thursday, a day that began like any other, but would end in a seismic shift. The weather had turned decisively warm, the first real languid warmth of spring, a welcome reprieve from the biting cold of winter. The air, thick with humidity, smelled of wet earth, of burgeoning life, of the sweet intoxicating scent of jasmine beginning to bloom. The workers in the quarters, their bodies weary, but their spirits lifted by the promise of easier days, finished their day's labor in the fields, their hoes and shovels clanking softly, and returned to their cabins, grateful for the longer daylight hours. At the main house, the routine of power and privilege continued. Lucien Deo was in his study, a room heavy with the scent of old leather and cigar smoke, reviewing his ledgers by the soft glow of a single oil lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. Cry was in the parlor, sprawled in a velvet armchair, idly flipping through a week-old newspaper, his attention elsewhere. Julian, ever restless, was in the stables, the air thick with the smell of hay and horse flesh, drinking cheap whiskey from a flask and meticulously cleaning his favorite rifle, its barrel gleaming ominously. The twins, Cora and Clara, were in their small, cold room, as they had been every night for 3 months, their presence a silent, almost forgotten fixture of the East Wing. At approximately 9 o'clock, as the last vestiges of twilight faded into a moonless, stardust night, Deline the cook was walking back to her cabin in the quarters. Her day was done, her feet aching, her mind already anticipating the brief respite of sleep. As she passed the main house, her gaze, habitually scanning for any sign of trouble or unusual activity, drifted towards the East Wing, and then she stopped, her breath catching in her throat, a sudden cold knot forming in her stomach. The East Wing window, the window of the twins' room, was open. This was profoundly unusual. Delphine remembered distinctly that the window had been nailed shut back in January after Julian, in a fit of pique, had complained that the twins were staring out of it too much, their silent gazes unsettling him. Deline herself had seen the nails, long and thick, driven deep into the wooden frame, securing it with an almost brutal finality. But now the window was undeniably open. A dark rectangular void against the dimly lit wall, and the thin, grimy curtain was fluttering gently in the soft night breeze. A silent signal. Deline stood frozen in the darkness, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, watching, waiting. And then she saw movement. A shadow impossibly quick and low passed across the open window, and then another, a mirror image. The twins were climbing out. Deline's first instinctive reaction was to cry out, to raise the alarm, to fulfill her unspoken duty to the Baron. But something stopped her. A powerful, almost primal force. Maybe it was the way the twins moved, silent, deliberate, purposeful, like creatures of the night. Maybe it was the memory of the sharp splintering sounds she had heard coming from the carriage house weeks ago, sounds she had tried to forget. Maybe it was the simple, profound human understanding that some people, no matter their station, deserve to run, deserve a chance at escape. Or perhaps it was the chilling realization that their escape, however improbable, was a silent act of justice. She said nothing. She simply turned, her movements slow and deliberate, and walked back to her cabin, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her ears straining for any sound from the house. She did not look back, not once, fearing that to do so might break the fragile spell, might betray the silent pact she had just made with her conscience. The twins dropped from the window onto the soft, damp ground below, landing with a practiced grace that spoke of careful preparation. They rolled, absorbing the impact, and came up running, their bare feet silent on the dew-kissed grass. They did not head for the main road, nor for the river, which offered a perilous escape. Instead, they ran toward the quarters, a cluster of dark, silent cabins nestled at the edge of the Deer property. They moved through the darkness like wisps of smoke slipping between cabins, their forms barely discernible against the deeper shadows. They avoided the few workers who were still outside, lingering by their cabin doors, enjoying the cool night air. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, their path unerring, as if they had planned this moment, rehearsed it countless times in their minds, as if they had been waiting for this precise confluence of warmth, darkness, and opportunity. They stopped at a cabin near the very edge of the quarters, a small, humble structure that housed a woman named Iris and her 3 young children. Iris was a widow. Her husband, a quiet, hard-working man, had died 2 years prior in a tragic accident involving a runaway plough and a spooked horse. She worked the fields from dawn till dusk, her back bent, her hands calloused, and kept mostly to herself, her grief, a silent companion. The other workers respected her for her quiet strength, her unwavering resilience in the face of relentless hardship. The twins approached the cabin door, their hearts pounding, and knocked softly, a hesitant, almost imperceptible tap. Iris opened it, her face etched with weariness, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She saw them standing there in the pale moonlight, 2 identical figures, their faces stark and serious, and she froze, a gasp catching in her throat. Her first thought was that they were ghosts or perhaps a dream. "Please," one of the twins said, her voice a soft hoarse whisper, barely audible above the chirping of crickets. It was the first word anyone had heard either of them speak in 3 months. A sound so fragile it seemed it might shatter. Her voice was rough, as if unused, a rusty hinge creaking open. "Please, we need help." Iris stared at them for a long agonizing moment, her mind racing, trying to reconcile the silent ghost-like figures she had seen with these two desperate speaking girls. The implications of their presence on her doorstep were terrifying. Then slowly she stepped aside, her movement stiff, and let them in, closing the door softly behind them, plunging the small cabin into near darkness. Inside the cabin, by the flickering uncertain light of a single tallow candle, the twins, Cora and Clara, finally told their story. Their voices, though still soft, gained strength as they spoke. The words flowing out, a dam breaking. They were not from Louisiana. They were from Virginia, from a small, unassuming town near Richmond, nestled amidst rolling hills and tobacco fields. Their mother had been a gifted seamstress, her nimble fingers capable of intricate embroidery. Their father a strong, dependable blacksmith, his forge a constant source of warmth and light. They had lived a quiet life, a good life filled with the simple rhythms of work and family until tragedy struck in the summer of 1872. Their parents had died in a sudden, devastating fire that consumed their small home, leaving them orphaned and alone. The twins, who were barely 13 at the time, had no other family, no kin to take them in. They were taken in by a local church, its pastor promising to find them a safe home, a new beginning. Instead, the church, burdened by its own poverty, and the overwhelming number of war orphans, had sold them. Not officially, of course, not legally, not with a bill of sale, but sold them nonetheless to a man who dealt in children, orphans, runaways, anyone who would not be missed, anyone whose absence would go unremarked. The man, a shadowy figure who moved between states, had taken them to New Orleans, a city teeming with both opportunity and desperation. There they were kept in a cramped, squalid house with other children, all of them waiting like livestock to be sold again, their futures hanging by a thread. In December of 1873, Lucien Deer had come to that house. He had inspected the children with a cold, calculating gaze, his eyes devoid of pity, the way one might inspect a herd of cattle. And he had chosen the twins, their identical features and quiet demeanor, apparently appealing to his sense of acquisition. He had paid in cash, a thick wad of bills, and had taken them away, their fate sealed. They had been at the Devoe estate for 3 months. 3 months of being locked in a small cold room, of being used, of being treated as things rather than people, their humanity systematically stripped away. They had endured it because they had no choice, no means of escape. But they had also been planning meticulously, patiently, their minds working in the shadows, because the twins had a secret, a weapon more potent than any physical force. They could read and they could write. Their mother had taught them back in Virginia before the fire, instilling in them a love for knowledge that transcended their circumstances. And in the dough house, in the dusty, forgotten library, they had found books, old books, forgotten books, books that no one thought to lock away, for who would care about such things? They had read them in secret late at night by the faint stolen light of a candle or the pale glow of the moon. And they had learned things. They had learned about the law, about the intricate dance of contracts and property, about the loopholes that existed in the chaotic aftermath of Reconstruction. They understood that while the spirit of the law might be ignored, the letter of the law, if properly invoked, still held sway, and they had learned about the courthouse in Greensburg, about the power of official documents of signatures and stamps. When Henri had taken them into town in early March, ostensibly to file the document that would legally bind them to the Deo family, Cora had acted. While Henri, engrossed in his own self-importance, spoke with the clerk, Cora, with a heart hammering against her ribs, had slipped away. She had found the records room, a labyrinth of shelves and dusty ledgers, and with a flash of insight, she had located the specific ledger where their fate was to be recorded. And she had stolen a blank page, a pristine official sheet of paper waiting to be filled with words of freedom. It was that page, folded small and tucked into Cora's sleeve, that the twins now showed to Iris. It was their declaration, their desperate plea. "We can write our own document," Cora said, her voice gaining a quiet conviction. "We can say we were freed. We can say we have the right to leave, but we need a witness. Someone who will sign it, someone who will say it is true, someone who will stand with us. Iris looked at the blank paper, then at the twins, their faces earnest and determined in the candle light, then back at the paper. The weight of their request settled upon her, heavy and terrifying. "If I sign this," she said slowly, her voice barely a whisper, "and they find out, they will kill me. They will kill my children." The fear was raw, palpable. "If you do not sign it," the other twin, Clara, said quietly, her voice steady, "they will kill us, and they will continue to do what they do. Nothing will change." Iris was silent for a long, agonizing time. Outside, the night was still and warm, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely sound in the vast darkness. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, making the twins' faces seem both ethereal and resolute. She thought of her own children, sleeping soundly in the next room, and the precariousness of their existence. She thought of the injustices she had witnessed, the quiet suffering of her community, and she thought of the courage these two young girls, barely more than children themselves, possessed. Finally, with a deep shuddering breath, Iris reached for the pen, its nib scratching faintly against the rough paper of the table. Her hand trembled, but her resolve, once found, was firm. Iris signed the document in the early hours of March 20th, just before the first faint blush of dawn touched the eastern sky. Her hand shook visibly as she wrote her name. The simple, elegant script, a testament to her own quiet education, but her signature, once completed, was clear and legible, a defiant mark against the Baron's power. The twins, their faces alike with a fragile hope, thanked her with a profound, silent gratitude. They folded the precious paper carefully, meticulously, and tucked it back into Cora's sleeve. A secret weapon hidden in plain sight. "What will you do now?" Iris asked, her voice still laced with a tremor of fear, but also with a burgeoning sense of awe. "We will leave," Clara said, her voice now imbued with a quiet certainty. "Tonight before they notice we are gone, before the sun fully rises and illuminates our absence. And if they catch you," Iris pressed, her gaze searching their faces. The thought of the Baron's retribution was a cold dread in her stomach. The twins looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding forged in hardship. And for the first time, Iris saw something in their dark eyes that was not fear, not despair, but something colder, something harder, something utterly unyielding. It was a glint of steel, a spark of defiance. "They will not catch us," Cora said, her voice flat, resolute. But they did not leave that night because before they could, before the first rays of the sun could fully pierce the darkness, something happened that changed everything, accelerating their carefully laid plans into a desperate, immediate gamble. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, as the first roosters began to crow, Julian Devo, restless and bored even in the early hours, decided to make his way to the east wing to check on the twins. He found the door locked as always, a symbol of his control. But when he unlocked it and pushed it open, the small room was empty. The narrow bed was undisturbed, the single chair vacant. The window, which he himself had ordered nailed shut, was open, the thin, grimy curtain fluttering gently in the Nent morning breeze, a silent, mocking banner of escape. Julian's face, usually flushed with drink or anger, went stark white. A cold, primal fear, unfamiliar and unwelcome, gripped him. He ran downstairs, his heavy boots pounding on the polished wood, shouting for his father, for his brother, for anyone who could hear him. His voice raw with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Within minutes, the entire Deru estate was plunged into chaos. The quiet morning, usually reserved for the slow, deliberate preparations for the day's work, was shattered by shouts and frantic activity. Lucian Devo, roused from his sleep, his face a mask of fury, ordered an immediate, comprehensive search. Every cabin in the quarters was to be inspected, every nook and cranny turned inside out. Every worker was to be questioned, their answers scrutinized for any hint of complicity. The twins were to be found, and they were to be brought back, no matter the cost, no matter what it took. His authority, his very image of control, had been challenged, and that was an unforgivable offense. Henri, ever the dutiful, if cruel son, took a group of armed men and began systematically searching the vast fields, his eyes narrowed, his rifle held ready. Julian, his face still pale with shock and rage, took another group and scoured the dense woods along the river, his movements erratic, his temper simmering. Lucien himself, his silver hair disheveled, his eyes blazing, went directly to the quarters, moving from cabin to cabin, his presence a terrifying storm, demanding answers, his voice booming with barely contained wrath. The workers, roused from their sleep, stood silently, their faces impassive, their eyes carefully blank. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. Their collective ignorance was a shield, a silent act of resistance. Lucien's face grew darker with each denial, each blank stare. But he did not press them. Not yet. He knew the futility of brute force against a wall of silence, but his patience was wearing thin. By midday, the search had expanded beyond the Devo property, radiating outwards like ripples in a pond. Riders were dispatched to neighboring plantations, to the small town of Greensburg, to the bustling river docks. A detailed description of the twins was circulated. Identical girls 14 or 15 years old, light brown skin, dark hair braided tightly, wearing plain grey dresses, but no one had seen them. The delta, vast and unforgiving, seemed to have swallowed them whole. By evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows, Lucien Dever was beyond furious. He gathered his sons in his study, the air thick with tension, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The workers standing outside in the yard, their ears straining, could hear his voice, a low, guttural roar, though they could not make out the specific words. The sound was enough. It spoke of a man pushed to the brink. And then, just after sunset, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, something happened that no one, not even Lucien Devo, in his wildest imaginings, expected. The twins walked out of the quarters. They walked calmly, deliberately, side by side, their hands folded neatly in front of them, their faces composed almost serene. They walked across the dusty yard, past the stables where the horses whinnied nervously, past the old carriage house, and stopped directly in front of the main house, their small figures silhouetted against the lamplit veranda. Their return was not a surrender, but a calculated, audacious challenge. Lucien Deo, who had been pacing the Ver like a caged tiger, stopped dead, staring at them in utter disbelief. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, no words coming out. "Where have you been?" he finally demanded, his voice with a mixture of rage and shock. The question was less about their physical location and more about the audacity of their return. Cora, her movement slow and deliberate, reached into her sleeve and pulled out the folded document. It was the blank page now filled with precise, elegant script signed and witnessed. She held it up, extending it towards Lucien so that he could see it clearly in the fading light. "We have been freed," she said, her voice calm, steady, without a trace of fear. A stark contrast to the trembling whisper Iris had heard hours earlier. "This document says so. It is signed and witnessed. We are no longer your property. Baron Devo." Lucien descended the steps slowly, his eyes fixed on the paper, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing, what he was hearing. He took the document from Cora's outstretched hand, his fingers brushing hers, and unfolded it with a jerky, almost violent motion. His eyes scanned the words, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing, the silence punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant croaking of frogs from the bayou. Then a sound escaped his lips. It began as a low chuckle, then escalated into a harsh, bitter laugh devoid of any genuine amusement. It was a cold, chilling sound, and it made the workers who were watching from the shadows of the quarters shiver, a collective ripple of unease passing through them. "This," Lucien said, holding up the paper, his hand trembling slightly, "is forgery, a clumsy, pathetic forgery. Do you really think this will save you? Do you truly believe such a crude deception will stand against my word?" "It is not a forgery," Clarara said, her voice equally calm, equally resolute. "It is a legal document. It was filed in the courthouse in Greensburg. It is on record. It is official." Lucien's mocking smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, then dawning horror. "What?" he whispered, the single word sharp disbelieving. "We filed it this morning," Cora explained, her voice precise, almost pedagogical. "Before you woke up, before you knew we were gone. It is in the ledger now. It is official. It is the law. Lucien's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed a deep, angry red. He crumpled the paper in his fist, crushing the words of freedom, and took a menacing step toward the twins, his eyes blazing with a dangerous fury. "You think you are clever?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous, a predator's growl. "You think you can outsmart me, Adeo? But you are wrong. I will go to that courthouse and I will have that document removed. I will have it burned, erased from existence, and then I will bring you back here, and I will make sure you never try this again. I will break you." "You cannot remove it," Cora said, her voice unwavering, her gaze meeting his with an unnerving directness. "Because it is not the only copy." Lucien froze, his menacing stride halted mid-step. The air crackled with a sudden profound tension. "We made 3 copies," Clara elaborated, her voice a soft, chilling echo of her sister's. "One is in the courthouse, officially filed. One is with a witness who will testify on our behalf. A person of good standing in this community. And one is hidden where you will never find it. A safeguard. If anything happens to us, if we disappear, if we are harmed, all 3 copies will be made public. And everyone will know what you did. Everyone will know that you bought us. Everyone will know that you kept us as slaves 9 years after slavery was abolished. Your name, Baron Deo, will be synonymous with shame." Lucien stared at them, his jaw working, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. His hands, still clenched into fists, trembled with suppressed rage. The audacity, the sheer unimaginable defiance of these 2 girls was a blow to his very core. "Who is the witness?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper laced with a desperate, chilling threat. The twins said nothing, their silence now a powerful weapon. "Who is the witness?" Lucien roared, his voice echoing across the silent yard, shattering the fragile peace of the evening. And then, from the shadows of the quarters, a voice spoke. It was a woman's voice, trembling slightly, but clear and resolute, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I am." Iris stepped forward out of the deep shadows cast by the cabins into the pale lamplight spilling from the main house. Her figure was small, but her presence in that moment was immense. She was trembling, yes, but her gaze fixed on Lucy and Deborah was steady, unwavering. "I signed the document," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I am the witness, and I will testify to its truth." Lucien turned to her, his eyes blazing with a renewed terrifying fury. For a moment the workers watching from the quarters thought he might strike her, might unleash his full, unbridled wrath upon this brave, defiant woman. But he did not. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across his face. That same cold, bitter smile that had sent shivers down Tobias Holt's spine. "Then you will hang with them," he said, his voice a low, venomous promise. "All of you, you will all pay for this insolence." What happened next is a matter of public record, though the records themselves, as is often the case in such volatile times, are incomplete, fragmented, and deliberately obscured. The official narratives often omit the inconvenient truths, the uncomfortable details that challenge the established order. On the crisp cool morning of March 21, 1874, the air still carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint promise of spring, Lucien Deer rode into Greensburg. He was not alone. His sons, Henri and Julianne, rode beside him, their faces grim, their expressions a mixture of anger and apprehension. Behind them, 3 armed men, hardened overseers from the Deer estate, rode with rifles slung across their saddles, their presence a clear, unspoken threat. The small cavalcade moved with a grim determination, kicking up dust on the main street, drawing the weary glances of the few townspeople already stirring. Lucien went directly to the courthouse, its brick facade looking particularly imposing in the morning light. He strode inside, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor, his presence filling the quiet space with an almost palpable menace. He demanded to see the ledger where property documents were filed, his voice booming, echoing off the high ceilings. The clerk, a nervous young man named Thomas Whitley, barely out of his teens, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, emerged from a back office. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved the massive leather-bound ledger from its shelf, its pages thick with the history of land and ownership in St. Helena Parish. He placed it on the counter, its weight thudding softly, and opened it to the most recent entries, his eyes darting nervously between the Baron and the open page. There, dated March 20, 1874, in clear, precise script, was a document. It stated unequivocally that two girls, Cora and Clara, formerly held by Lucy and Devo, had been legally freed and were no longer subject to any claim of ownership, their freedom now enshrined in the very records that had once sought to bind them. The document was signed by Iris, listed prominently as a witness, her signature clear and resolute, and crucially, it was countersigned by a justice of the peace named Albert Finch, his official stamp, lending it undeniable legal weight. Lucian's eyes, narrowed to slits, devoured the words. His face, already flushed with anger, deepened to a dangerous purple. He slammed his fist on the counter, making Whitley jump. He demanded to see Finch, his voice a low growl. The clerk, stammering, explained that Finch had left town that very morning, heading north to Baton Rouge on urgent family business, and would not return for several days, a convenient or perhaps preant absence. Lucien then demanded that the document be immediately removed, torn from the ledger, erased from existence. Whitley, his face pale, shook his head. He explained, his voice barely a whisper, that he did not have the authority to remove a legally filed document without a court order, a judge's explicit command. The ledger, once an entry was made, was sacrosanct. Lucien, his patience utterly exhausted, slammed his fist on the desk again, the sound echoing through the quiet courthouse. He told the terrified clerk that he would have the document removed one way or another, with or without his cooperation. His eyes, burning with a cold fury, promised dire consequences, and then he left, his heavy footsteps thudding ominously, his sons and armed men following in his wake. But he did not go back to the estate. Instead, his rage still simmering, he went directly to the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building across the dusty square. The sheriff of St. Helena Parish in 1874 was a man named Cyrus Tate. He was in his late 50s, a man whose face was a road map of hard living and difficult choices. A former Confederate officer, he had returned home after the war to find his world, his entire way of life turned upside down. He did not like Reconstruction, did not like the new federal laws, did not like the idea that people he had once considered property were now legally his equals. He harbored a deep-seated resentment for the changes sweeping the South. But he was also a practical man, a pragmatist who understood the shifting tides of power. He knew that the law, however much he disliked its new iterations, was still the law, and his duty was to uphold it, however reluctantly. Lucien Devo burst into Tate's office, his anger radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He told Tate in no uncertain terms that two girls had stolen property from him, that they had forged a legal document, and that they were inciting rebellion among his workers. He demanded that they be immediately arrested and returned to his custody, their insolence punished. Tate, a man of few words, listened patiently, his gaze steady, unblinking. When Lucien finished his furious tirade, Tate asked calmly to see the document. Lucien, still seething, produced the crumpled copy that Cora had given him, tossing it onto Tate's desk with a dismissive gesture. Tate picked it up, smoothed out the creases, and read it slowly, meticulously, his eyes tracing each word. Then he looked up at Lucien, his expression unreadable. "This says they were freed, Mr. Dero," Tate stated, his voice flat, devoid of judgment. "It is a forgery," Lucien roared, his fist slamming onto the desk, making the inkwell jump. "A blatant criminal forgery. Do you have proof of this forgery, Mr. Devo?" Tate asked, his voice still calm, his gaze unwavering. "A sworn affidavit, a witness to the act of falsification." "I do not need proof," Lucien thundered, his face contorted with rage. "They are my property. They were purchased legally before the eyes of God and man." Tate leaned back in his creaking wooden chair, his gaze sweeping over Lucien, then to the crumpled document. "Mr. Devo, with all due respect, slavery is illegal. Has been for 9 years. The 13th Amendment. If these girls were held against their will, that is a crime. And if this document is on file at the courthouse signed by a justice of the peace, then as far as the law is concerned, they are free. My hands are tied." Lucien's face went dark. A dangerous storm cloud gathering. Whose side are you on, Tate? He snarled. The question a thinly veiled threat. I am on the side of the law, Mr. Devo, Tate said, his voice hardening slightly, a flicker of steel in his eyes. And the law as it stands says they are free. I cannot arrest free citizens without cause. Lucien stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor, his hands shaking with barely suppressed rage. Then the law, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt, is wrong, and you, sheriff, are a fool. He turned abruptly and walked out of the sheriff's office, his sons and his men following, leaving Tate alone in the quiet office, the crumpled document still on his desk. And that is when things began to unravel, not just for Lucien Devo, but for the fragile peace of Greensburg itself. Because Lucien Devo in his blinding fury made a catastrophic mistake. He went back to the courthouse, his mind consumed by a singular destructive purpose. To erase the document, to obliterate the evidence of his humiliation. Thomas Whitley, the young clerk, was still behind the counter, his face pale, his hands still trembling. He saw Lucien and his entourage re-enter, and a cold dread settled over him. Lucien strode directly to the counter, his eyes fixed on the ledger. He demanded it again, his voice low and menacing. Whitley, summoning a desperate courage, refused to hand it over. He clutched the ledger to his chest, his knuckles white. Lucien, without a word, grabbed the young man by the collar of his shirt, his grip like iron, and shoved him violently against the wall, the impact rattling the shelves of documents. Cree and Julien stood by watching, their faces impassive, while the three armed men positioned themselves by the door, blocking any escape, any intervention. But Whitley was not alone in the courthouse that day. There were other people present, a few other clerks, a couple of lawyers reviewing documents, a handful of townspeople filing papers, and they saw what happened. They saw the Baron, a man of immense power, physically assaulting a public official. His rage unchecked. One of them, a respected local lawyer named Marcus Hale, a man known for his quiet integrity and sharp legal mind, stepped forward. He was a man of medium height with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent piercing eyes. He had witnessed the entire scene, his initial shock giving way to a cold, righteous anger. He told Lucien, his voice calm but firm, to release the clerk. Lucien, his focus entirely on the ledger and the terrified Whitley, ignored him, his grip tightening. Hale raised his voice, making it carry through the suddenly silent courthouse. Mr. Devo, you are assaulting a public official. This is a grave offense. If you do not release him immediately, I will have you arrested. Lucien turned slowly, his eyes blazing with a wild, dangerous light, finally acknowledging Hale's presence. You will do nothing, lawyer, he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. You will stand aside and mind your own business. I will do what the law requires, Mr. Dero, Hale retorted, his voice unwavering, his gaze meeting Lucien's with equal intensity, and the law requires that I report this assault. And then in a moment of unbridled incandescent rage, a moment he would later regret with a bitterness that would consume him, Lucandier drew a small silver-plated pistol from his coat pocket. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoed loudly in the sudden profound silence of the courthouse. He pointed it directly at Marcus Hale, his hand trembling slightly, but his intent clear. The room went utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The air crackled with an unbearable tension. The law, Lucien said, his voice shaking with fury, is whatever I say it is, and I say you will be silent. But before he could utter another word, before he could make another move, Sheriff Tate walked into the courthouse. He had heard the commotion from his office across the dusty street, the shouts, the thud of bodies, the sudden chilling silence. He had come to investigate, his hand already resting on the butt of his own revolver. When he saw Lucien Deo, pistol drawn, pointed at a respected citizen. He drew his own weapon, its heavy weight familiar in his hand. Put it down, Devo, Tate said, his voice low, steady, and utterly devoid of negotiation. The authority in his voice was absolute. Lucien did not move, his eyes still fixed on Hale, his finger hovering near the trigger. Put it down or I will shoot you where you stand. Tate repeated, his voice now colder, sharper, a clear warning. I will not hesitate. For a long, agonizing moment, no one breathed. The fate of Greensburg, perhaps even the parish, hung in the balance, suspended on the edge of a single violent act. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lucien lowered the gun. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a dawning realization of the gravity of his actions. Tate walked forward, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving Lucien. He took the pistol from Lucien's hand, its cold metal heavy in his palm. And then, with a swift, decisive motion, he placed Lucien Deveau under arrest. Henry and Julian, finally roused from their stunned silence, protested loudly, stepping forward, their faces contorted with outrage. The three armed men, their rifles now useless, moved towards Tate, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. But Tate, his gun still drawn, raised it slightly, his gaze sweeping over them cold and uncompromising. He told them, his voice hard, that if they took one more step, if they made one more move, he would shoot them all. They stopped, their bravado evaporating in the face of Tate's unwavering resolve. Lucien Deer, the Baron, the man who believed himself above all law, was taken to the parish jail, a small dank building behind the courthouse. He was held overnight, his fury slowly congealing into a bitter, impotent rage. The next morning he was brought before Judge Horace Bellamy, a stern, unyielding man who had little patience for the arrogance of the planter class. Lucien was charged with assault, attempted theft of public records, and threatening a public official. The judge, his face impassive, was not sympathetic. He set bail at $5,000, an enormous sum for the time designed to keep a man incarcerated, and ordered Lucien to remain in custody until it was paid. But the damage, the irreparable damage to Lucien Deau's reputation and authority was already done. Because the story of what had happened in the courthouse spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone in Greensburg knew. They knew that Lucien Deveau, the all-powerful Baron, had tried to steal a legal document, that he had assaulted a clerk, that he had drawn a gun on a respected lawyer, and that he had been arrested by Sheriff Tate. And everyone knew why. Because two girls, two former slaves, two children had outsmarted him. They had used his own system, his own laws against him. And in doing so, they had shattered his illusion of invincibility. The whispers in the quarters, the silent defiance had finally found its voice, and it had brought down a titan. Lucien Deveau was eventually released from jail 3 days later after his lawyers, working frantically, managed to arrange for the exorbitant bail to be posted. The sum, a significant portion of his liquid assets, was a bitter pill to swallow, a tangible cost of his humiliation. But by then the story had spread far beyond the dusty confines of Greensburg. Newspapers in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, eager for sensational headlines, picked it up, embellishing the details, painting Lucien as a caricature of the Old South's dying arrogance. Within a week, the tale of the Baron and the defiant twins was being discussed in parlors and saloons across Louisiana, a scandal that captivated and divided. The reaction was sharply divided, reflecting the deep fissures that still ran through post-Reconstruction society. Some people, mostly those who had staunchly supported the Confederacy, who resented the federal government's intervention and who clung desperately to the old social order, saw Lucien as a victim of an unjust system. They argued that the twins had no right to file a legal document, that the whole affair was a farce orchestrated by carpetbaggers and radical Republicans, and that Lucien had been entirely within his rights to try to reclaim what was, in their eyes, rightfully his property. They saw his actions as a desperate defense of tradition, a last stand against an encroaching, unwelcome modernity. But others, including many who harbored no particular love for Reconstruction, but understood that the law, however imperfect, was now the reigning authority, saw Lucien as a criminal, plain and simple. He had held 2 girls as slaves. 9 years after slavery had been abolished, a blatant violation of federal law, he had assaulted a public official. He had threatened violence in a courthouse, a sacred space of justice, and he had been caught. His hubris exposed for all to see. His actions were not a defense of tradition, but an act of lawlessness, a dangerous challenge to the fragile new order. The legal case against Lucien Deer dragged on for months, a protracted, bitter battle fought in the stifling heat of the Louisiana summer. Lucien's formidable team of lawyers argued vehemently that the document filed by the twins was invalid, that it had been obtained through fraud and coercion, and that the girls should be returned to his custody, their freedom revoked. They painted the twins as cunning manipulators, tools of outside agitators. But the twins, Cora and Clarara, had something Lucy and Devo did not. The undeniable, unvarnished truth, and they had the courage to speak it. They testified in court, their voices still soft, but clear and unwavering, their composure remarkable for their age. They recounted with chilling precision how they had been taken from their home in Virginia, sold in the shadowy markets of New Orleans, and then kept as slaves by Lucian Doer, their lives reduced to cattle. They described the conditions in which they had been held, the small cold room, the meager food, the constant surveillance. They spoke of the subtle cruelties, the dehumanization, the way they had been treated as property rather than people, their very humanity denied. Their testimony delivered with quiet dignity, cut through the legal jargon and the lawyer's bluster, reaching the hearts of many in the courtroom. Iris testified as well, her presence a powerful symbol of community solidarity. She confirmed that she had witnessed the document, that she had heard the twins' story, and that she believed them implicitly. Her quiet strength, her willingness to risk everything lent immense credibility to their claims. And Marcus Hale, the lawyer who had confronted Luten in the courthouse, took on the twins' case pro bono, driven by a deep sense of justice. He argued passionately that the document was legal and binding, that the twins had every right to file it, and that Lucian Deer had committed multiple egregious crimes in his desperate, violent attempt to reclaim them. He presented the case not just as a matter of property, but as a fundamental question of human rights and the rule of law in a changing South. In August of 1874, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, Judge Horace Bellamy delivered his verdict. His voice, usually dry and legalistic, carried a rare note of solemnity. He declared that the document was valid, that Cora and Clarara were unequivocally free citizens of the United States, and that Lucian Devo was guilty of assault, attempted theft of public records, and threatening a public official. Lucien was fined $2,000, a substantial sum, but a mere fraction of his wealth, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. The sentence was meant to be a deterrent, a public declaration that even the most powerful were not above the law. But Lucien Deo never served the sentence. On the night of August 15, 1874, under the cover of a moonless sky, Lucien Deo disappeared. He left his sprawling estate, left his sons, left everything he had built and coveted, and was never seen again. The circumstances of his vanishing were shrouded in mystery, fueling endless speculation. Some said he fled south across the border to Mexico, seeking refuge from the law and his shattered reputation. Some whispered that he had sailed to Europe, to a continent where his barren title might hold more weight. Others, the more cynical, suggested he had taken his own life, unable to bear the shame and humiliation. No one knows for certain. His disappearance became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. Cree and Julian Deo tried in their own inept ways to maintain the estate, to cling to the remnants of their father's empire, but without Lucien's iron will, his cunning, and his ruthless efficiency, they could not hold it together. Workers emboldened by the twins' victory began to leave, seeking better opportunities or simply freedom from the Deo name. Debts long managed by Lucien's shrewd hand piled up, overwhelming the feckless sons. Within 2 years, the once grand Deo property, its fields overgrown, its house falling into disrepair, was sold at auction, its legacy dissolved into obscurity. Henry, his spirit broken, his cruelty now aimless, moved to the rough and tumble frontier of Texas and died in a drunken bar fight in 1879. A pathetic end to a life of privilege. Julia, consumed by his vices, drank himself to death in a squalid New Orleans boarding house in 1881. His body found by a sympathetic landlady. The Deer name, once a symbol of immense power and fear in St. and Helena Parish, faded into obscurity, becoming little more than a footnote in the parish's troubled history. As for the twins, Cora and Clarara, they left St. Helena Parish in the fall of 1874, their departure quiet and unceremonious, a stark contrast to their dramatic arrival. Iris, the brave widow who had risked everything for them, went with them along with her 3 children. They traveled north, a long, arduous journey, eventually settling in a small Quaker-influenced town outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a place far removed from the humid, oppressive Delta. There, in their new home, Cora and Clara opened a small school for freed children, a beacon of hope in a community eager for education. They taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Their lessons imbued with a quiet passion. And they never charged a fee, believing that knowledge should be freely given. They lived quietly, modestly, their lives dedicated to empowering others through the very tools that had secured their own freedom. They never spoke publicly about what had happened to them in Louisiana. The trauma too deep, the memories too painful to share with strangers. But they kept the document. The original signed and witnessed, the blank page that had become their Declaration of Independence, was carefully framed and hung on the wall of their small schoolhouse, a silent testament to their courage. And beneath it, in Cora's careful, elegant handwriting was a single profound sentence. Some gifts are not meant to be kept. Iris lived with them until her death in 1891. A beloved matriarch, her quiet strength, a constant presence. Her children grew up, married, and had children of their own. Their lives flourishing in the freedom their mother had helped secure. And they all knew the story passed down through generations of the twin girls who had outsmarted a baron, who had used the power of words to change everything, and of the brave woman who had stood with them. Cora and Clara lived long, fulfilling lives, their bond unbroken. They died within a week of each other in the harsh winter of 1929, their bodies finally succumbing to the passage of time. They were buried side by side in a small, unassuming cemetery in Pennsylvania. Their graves unmarked, their names known only to a few. But their story, a testament to resilience, courage, and the quiet power of defiance, remains. It is a story that reminds us that history is not always written by the powerful, but sometimes by the silent, the overlooked, and the brave. What do you think of this story? Does it resonate with the hidden histories you believe are still buried in the records of places like St. Helena Parish? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories that make you question what really happened and challenge conventional narratives, then subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves stories that delve into the profound depths of the past.